All financial support for this podcast comes from my patrons on patreon.com. If you'd like to join in with the patrons, please check out patreon.com/DarwinGross. That's DarwinGrosse. Now enjoy the podcast. Okay, today I have the great opportunity to speak with someone I have wanted to talk to for quite a while. Actually, I've wanted to talk to for about 2 decades, really. I first heard of him back when I was working with Grant Richter on the wired synthesizer system. This composer called up and wanted to start working on putting a system together, and he became one of the stalwarts of wired synthesizer user base. But I also, his name came up in several other interviews, and so we've finally been able to get hooked up here, and I'm very happy to have a chat with Gary Chang. Hey, Gary, how's it going?
Fine, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, right on. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule to have this discussion. So I know you from this interaction at Wired, but I also actually know you from the incredible body of work that you had. If I look up IMDb, they got you listed at like over 80 different projects that you worked on, which is just like an endless number of actual compositions and stuff. Why don't you fill us in a little bit about that body of work, and what are some of the highlights of that?
Well, I've always portrayed myself as an obscure electronic music composer whose side gig is scoring, Hollywood movies and TV shows. I got into scoring movies through being a session musician in the 80s, which eventually led me to work with Giorgio Moroder. Giorgio, well, the first job I did with Giorgio was A Never-Ending Story.
Oh,
and,
wow.
You think, so who am I? Well, I'm a synthesizer arranger. So what do? You have a composer asks you, can you, here's a piece, here's the arrangement. Can you basically put it together electronically for me? So you do it. And then the next time you get a call back, it's sort of, here's the piece, it's half arranged. Can you finish the arrangement and do the electronics, right? And then the next step is, here's the piece, can you arrange it like the last one? And do, so like eventually what happens is you generate more confidence with the people you work with. And so, a couple of movies in, I ended up just ghosting an entire movie for Giorgio called Electric Dreams. It was Virginia Madsen's first movie. I didn't get any credits for it, but Giorgio paid me handsomely, and I got to score a Hollywood movie using his themes. So I learned a lot about what I was set out to eventually do for the next 35 years. The first movie that I actually have a credit on as an additional music by is The Breakfast Club. And I contributed half an hour of music to that show. Other shows, the ones that everyone knows, I did Under Siege, I did The Island of Dr. Moreau.
Right.
I scored 8 movies for John Frankenheimer. I worked with a number of notable directors. But as I said, really, I'm like Peter Grenader and Joe Fraser. We all went to Cal Arts together. We all studied with Mort Subotnick together and had an amazing year with the who's who of 20th century music wandering through the halls of Cal Arts while I was a grad student. So, I have that background too. So it's an interesting thing. I'm kind of a Forrest Gump of electronic music. Presently, I'm working on a little short for a filmmaker named Stephen Saki. And Steve and I are, once again, we're Cal Artians. And this is the third movie that we're working on. So don't know exactly whether it will be all electronic. We're kind of at the early stages.
Okay, that's an amazing overview, and I have to say that I was I was pretty shocked because I knew of some of the work that you had done, but I was really, I was kind of blown away by the the size of the list, quite frankly, and just a sense that this represented a tremendous amount of work. Now, one of the things I especially noticed is that there were time periods where you did a phenomenal number of movie scores all in a single year. In doing this, were you doing largely electronic scores, or were you doing compositions that got orchestrated and performed by an orchestra? How did it work where you were able to do so many different projects in a single year?
Actually, they were all kind of all over the place, All of them employed a certain percentage of electronic and certain percentage of acoustic music, right? And the larger the budget, more orchestral and larger ensembles were used. It's interesting because part of the gift of my career was I was able to work repeatedly for a number of filmmakers. And that made it simpler because, less dating, so to speak. If you know what I mean.
Yeah, no doubt. Right. You probably at some point you ended up with a kind of a shared language so that you could understand each other, right?
Exactly. And, they had confidence that I could actually pull it off, I think every young composer, when you first get a job, they want you because you're different and you're unique. And, for me, about 3/4 of the way through virtually every project, filmmaker would call me up and say, "Hey, I just wanted to ask, can you just do really normal things too?" And, you have to basically show, yes, I can. Here's one,
That's hilarious.
You got to think that coming from a background where, I've had master classes with, John Cage and Elliot Carter and people like that. I mean, when you want to say, let's go outside, well, I could get pretty far out on the Hollywood standard.
Right.
I had a lot of fun doing it, though. It was a lot of pressure. It was, and to be honest with you, it doesn't make me upset that I'm out of the hot seat at this point. There's something wonderful about that. I feel the pandemic really kind of just wrote it home, which is, gee, not that much has changed here. I've been living, living and working out of my house for going on 40 years. So maybe it's kind of bizarre. Maybe I was all set to do this.
Right. You were well prepared, right?
Exactly.
So now you dropped a couple of hints about your background, but one of the things I like doing in my podcast is really digging into people's background and learning more about how they got to be the artists that they are. One of the things when we first lit up our Zoom call, you're in your studio surrounded by amazing synthesis technology. It's clear that, with your background as sort of a session synthesist, that you have a lot of facility with the technology of it, but you also have the musical chops to pull off this huge variety of tasks that's necessary to score a movie. I'm wondering where you're coming from that all of these things sort of fit the Gary Chang mold, right? What was your background that drew you into music? What's the background that drew you into technology? How did those things mesh? Was it in Cal Arts? Was it in place long before then? And who are some of the people that really lit up the landscape for you and made and helped you become the artist that you are?
Well, first of all, my mom and dad met in Boston. She was a student at New England Conservatory of Music. She was a mezzo-soprano. And my father was getting his Doctor of Science at MIT. And this might reveal to you where my background comes from, right? Because my mom is a real musician who sang when we were growing up. I mean, we listened to music all the time, but my father was an engineer, incidentally, a mining engineer. His first job was at the University of Minnesota, which is why I was born in Minneapolis. But my father was a hi-fi buff, and he built a few stereo systems in the 50s.
Okay.
And so, there's Gary downstairs in the basement hanging out with his dad. His dad's soldering up a Storm, right? And it's sort of like maybe it's the solder fumes or something that led me down this path of technology, and
early psychedelics, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's one thing that happened. The second thing is I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and when I applied to colleges, of course, I got into Carnegie Mellon University, but I didn't want to stay in Pittsburgh. I ended up going to Tufts University in Boston for my first year of college, and I'll be honest with you, I absolutely hated it. I really didn't like it. As a matter of fact, in January of that year, I auditioned for Carnegie Mellon, and I got into Carnegie Mellon. I transferred to Carnegie Mellon the following year. Okay. And the interesting thing about Boston, though, is it gave me the spring semester where essentially, I took conducting and piano lessons and modern dance. And, I just really, what do you want to say? I kind of fucked off, that spring, except, I'm in one of the student lounges in a quadrangle one afternoon, and I'm just playing the piano, and a gentleman came in and sat down and listened for a moment. And, after a while we got into a conversation, and, we talked about music, and eventually my opinion of Boston came out, and I said, I hate living here. And he said, why? And he said, because it's just a city of screaming children. You go to a concert and you can't hear the music because everyone's in the audience yelling, So he was really nice. He said, hey, what are you doing Friday? And it's nothing. Well, look, I'm going to take you out to dinner, and I'm going to show you my Boston. So I went out, and we had a really nice dinner, and we walked up Boylston Street, and he took me to the jazz workshop. We're standing in line, and I said to him, I hope you realize I'm 18 years old. I can't get in. At the time, the drinking age in Boston was 21. So the gentleman pulls out his driver's license. And at the time, Massachusetts driver's licenses didn't have pictures on it. And he says, look, 5'8", black hair, brown eyes. Here, use my driver's license. So I'm kind of uptight. I'm going to get thrown out of here, but they let me in. And there it is. I walk in, and at the Jazz Workshop that evening is the Herbie Hancock Sextet. And there's Herbie with his Rhodes and a wah-wah and the Echoplex and all the stuff. And this place is like church. It was packed, and everyone loved the hell out of the music. And of course I did too, but I got a chance to actually meet Herbie during a break and got to ask him about the structure of the music and all this kind of stuff. And at any rate, after the end of the evening, I'm just completely blown away by it. And I said, well, thank you, man. I really appreciate it. Here's your driver's license back. And he said, oh no, just keep it. I'll get another one. That spring, I saw Herbie's band again. I saw, 2 albums, the Wandishi set, and I saw the Crossing set. I sat 5 days, 3 sets a night through all of that. It was amazing. I saw Miles with Keith Jarrett. I saw Return to Forever. I saw Weather Report. It completely changed my thinking about what music was. Part of it was because of the humans, right? Mm-hmm. These guys were actually making a living. These guys were actually dressed well. They were playing, they were having fun, they were getting paid to do that was something that was amazing, and it wasn't this frumpy academic or classical music path. It was something different.
Right.
So when I got to Carnegie Mellon, the interesting thing about that is Carnegie Mellon was like, well, that's really great, but deal with that later. Right now, this is a conservatory. This is conservative. You're going to learn harmony, counterpoint. You're going to learn the basics. This is what we're going to do. So I was completely resigned to that. I thought, well, okay, if this is what it takes, I'll do it. In the spring of 73, I guess, what happens is Paul Dvorak, until recently, was a professor at North Texas State. And he would, but when I knew him, he was a PhD in composition student at Carnegie Mellon. And he came into the Composers Forum one afternoon and said, hey, Carnegie Mellon just scored an artificial intelligence grant that only at this point MIT and Stanford have had. So the first thing they did was they went and they bought the Bell Laboratories library of software, and in it included music software. Mm-hmm. So is there anyone who's interested in this? Two of us raised our hands. The computer science department gave us $10,000 of computer time. And then you got to remember, this is 1972, right? We could literally live at the computer center with $10,000 of time.
Right.
So for that was the thing. For the next 3 years, we messed around with this, and it was kind of a strange thing. It was Stanford score and Music 10, and basically going over to the computer center and with the text editor writing some scripts and then sending them down, then running across the campus to another room that had a PDP 10 in it, which is a hybrid. So we could take the digital analog converters and plug them into an amplifier and hear the, literally hear 5 seconds of noise and go, okay, that's what we did, I mean, that's the funny thing, is that was my background in technology. They had an ARP 2600 there too. So it's for me, I'm channeling my Keith Jarrett, Joe Zawinul, Herbie Hancock, Chick Corea, wannabe vibe, and dragging around a Rhodes piano with Echoplex, and then the 2600 to do interesting different gigs and stuff like that around Pittsburgh, while studying actual computer code and stuff like that, and getting my bachelor's degree in music composition. So that's the funny thing, is it wasn't Cal Arts that widened my perception initially. It was something else, right? It was that semester in Boston that made me realize it's where I met Patrick Gleason, people I've known for years now.
My goodness. You just tripped into the middle of this stuff. It's just amazing.
That's why I say I'm kind of like, Forrest Gump, right? How did I end up meeting these people? And then a few years later, I'm standing there having conversations with Jacob Druckmann or Morton Feldman, or, it's really, and then later on, as in pop music, I got to work with my heroes. I got to work with Weather Report. I spent a day editing a piece of music with Jocko.
Unreal. How did you make the move from the East Coast to the West Coast? What made that transition? Was it to go to Cal Arts, or did you head that direction anyway?
Well, it always dawned on me that there were wider horizons other than Pittsburgh, Mm-hmm. No offense to my Pittsburgh friends, but I ended up going, the interesting thing is Richard Corrigan, the first president of Cal Arts, was an ex-dean of the Fine Arts College at Carnegie Mellon University.
Oh, okay.
And he moved from, Carnegie Mellon to NYU, and that's where he started the first multimedia art program, which included Subotnick and Mel Powell and Namjoon Pike, and all of these people wandered out to California to Cal Arts when Cal Arts was created.
Right.
You could go to Carnegie Mellon and find the Cal Arts catalogs in the library, So there was some sort of bizarre link to it. Although aesthetically, Cal Arts was a new music for the music department, was a new music satellite, and I cut my teeth with Mort, basically helping him do his projects.
Yeah.
We did the game room, and we did the first ghost pieces and stuff like that. Just helping him technically. This is basically, it was an amazing experience. And I have a lot of gratitude towards Mort, what I learned with him.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it sounds like an amazing experience. And I know so many people who've gone through the Cal Arts systems in many generational passes, but it always seems like it's a place where groups of people kind of come together and become sort of a generation of artists. They kind of clump together at Cal Arts and then expand out, right?
The funny thing about it, though, is Wayne Slauson said this when I met him after I went to Cal Arts. He said, all of you guys from Cal Arts are so different.
Yeah.
I can't, for the life of me, codify what you guys are or what you do. It's so diverse, right? And that's really the interesting mystique of Cal Arts. It's really the odd thing about it is it's the realization that Cal Arts was like studying with the Dalai Lama, but it's not everything. I don't have to sit there and drift back, wax romantically about my experience at Cal Arts. It's just another one of those things. I loved my experience as a professional.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I had a lot of fun doing what I've done in my life.
Yeah, so you're saying you don't have to just be romanticizing Cal Arts because it's just part of the long timeline.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of like one thing is meeting Herbie Hancock in a club when I'm 18. And then, the next thing is when I'm 21, having a master class with, Elliot Carter and, people like that. And then a few years later, I'm like in the recording studio with Robbie Robertson or Giorgio Moroder. Mm-hmm. And that's the thing that's really funny is part of the bizarre aspect of it for me is, well, does being Chinese American have anything to do with it? Maybe it does, because it's like I don't really fit any of the molds. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So you walked into the record plant, maybe now is different, but back in the 70s, you hardly ever saw any Chinese people or any Asian people,
right,
involved in the music business. So I think it's interesting because on one side of it, and I was involved with technology, so I could just kind of ride my stereotype.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So the way that you started getting into session work then, was it simply because both through Carnegie Mellon and your interactions at Cal Arts, especially working with Morton, which is going to be a master class in synthesis techniques, is it just that you had enough facility that you could kind of go into this new world and help people realize their dreams? Was that how you made your entree?
No, well, here's the thing, man, is you got to think well, first of all, when I got out of grad school, I was broke, just like everybody else.
Everyone, yeah.
But, one thing I managed to do was I managed to manipulate my situation to own and build my Surge modular system. And that's the next group of people that probably to discuss in my career that's important, is Surge. And the group of people that surrounds it, the lab in Hollywood. It's interesting because, it's hard to figure out what are you going to do with your life. You just got out of school and you feel like, well, I've accomplished this and this and this, but you go out and you show your wares around. And for me, half of them were saying, it's not good enough. It was I spent 6 months writing this piece. So, okay, well, Brahms spent 17 years writing this first symphony. So go back to work. Half of the people would say that.
Okay.
And the other half would say, this is fantastic. Let's go in the studio tomorrow and make 10 of them. Oh, so it's sort of like, oh, I get it. I don't have the chops here one way or other. So, part of it for me was I was broke. I needed to figure out how to do all this stuff. And so I set out and I tried to figure out how to interface, because I just spent 6 years in academia learning all this other stuff, not listening to the radio or anything. So the amazing thing that happened was I found a brochure at a studio someone had brought in, and it was for the Fairlight CMI. And basically, Fairlight, Jordy Hormel had just bought the Fairlight distribution for the US.
Okay.
And he opened an office at the Village Recorder. So I marched down there with my resume and I got the job as a product specialist.
Wow.
It's an interesting thing because this is where
you got to go around town showing people how it worked.
Not just around town, but I did all the trade shows. We did the computer music conventions. So suddenly it enabled Popper Gary to afford to get around and to meet everyone involved, right?
Sure.
So, eventually what happens is I left Fairlight and started doing session work for people who own the Fairlight. And, one of those people was Patrick Williams, the film composer who did a lot of stuff, but probably him for the Mary Tyler Moore Show and Lou Grant and, a bunch of things like that. But he's an amazing jazz, he arranged for Sinatra, a lot of different things. And I found working for people like this were amazing. I found myself on the soundstage with the A-team of LA recording musicians. And I was the worst I'll be the first one to say, I'm not a great reader, but I learned so much. Once again, it's like being the journeyman, right? Eventually, I'm going to try to be a composer.
Right.
I need to know all about this, right? And there's no better way than standing right in the middle of it. That eventually, after working for a few years in the studio scene, eventually I met Giorgio Moroder and got to work with him. And it led to my working on the Breakfast Club and my first credit there. And, from that point on, I start working, on my own.
Yeah. Now, the interesting thing is that your starting this was at a kind of a peculiar time frame because it was well before the computerization of a lot of this stuff. The technology, you literally surfed all of the technology changes practically that we've seen in modern music in the process of doing scoring, right?
Absolutely. You think about the whole concept of automation, right? Subotnick is a pioneer. His player piano technique of taking oscillators and recording fluctuations of volume on audio tape and then playing them back through envelope detectors, which would convert the fluctuations back into voltages, right?
Right.
And then, Don creating the 10-channel fixed filter bank that basically Mort could actually tune oscillators to pass only through the discrete 10 banks. He could put 10 oscillators on one track and play them back through the filter through individual envelope detectors and get all 10 control voltages for panning and, So at any rate, you have that. And then when the Fairlight came to town, we spent months working on a proper way to synchronize it so that, we could put a guide track on a 2-inch tape machine, and then we could do multiple passes in sync, right? Something that is like commonplace today, but like I said, this is back in the days when, well, if we don't do it, no one's going to do it.
Right. I think it's an important thing because, realistically now, if you're working to film, you'll just kind of like dump a mini version of the film onto your DAW and work right along with the picture. I mean, I was involved sort of like on the tail end of that where there was like synchronization with tape machines and stuff. It was an extraordinary headache, but I was doing it on this tiny world. You were doing it in these huge systems. I can't even imagine the technology and the stress involved in doing sync. It just is mind-boggling given how our technology is today.
Well, it is pretty amazing, like the whole idea of the fact that, you're doing a feature film. So they shoot that and they plug a transformer into the wall, and basically everything's referenced to this 60 cycle tone, right?
No.
So after the film and audio is recorded, synchronized to that, then it's transferred to video for editing. Well, it basically changes speed 1% in order to fit the 20, instead of it being 24 frames per second, it's 29.97 frames per second, right? And it's like, so now there's a speed fluctuation, and you do the entire post-production in a different speed than the movie. And then finally it's dubbed, it comes back down and it's pulled down in speed to synchronize with the 24 frames a second now. It's like totally insanity. And it's like, when HD came out, wow, what a
game changer. Yeah.
It's suddenly like we don't have to go nuts anymore. I mean, so on projects that involved, we need source music you have to produce for the shoot, and they're going to do something on the camera with the source music. That's it, is you have to record the music off speed, right? And then basically they play it so that when they play it on camera and they transfer it to video, it's the same pitch as the original.
Jeez.
So anyway, yes, it was totally insane. But you're right. My career went all the way from sprockets to hard drives.
Yeah, that's amazing. There's just the history you got to see in the making. What's interesting is, I didn't know this, but we actually have another intersection of people. You mentioned that Paul Dvorak was someone that was involved in Carnegie Mellon. He was a composition teacher for me when I was at North Texas.
Fantastic.
And it's funny how that works. But just bringing him up, how I remember him was as a person who was like really dialed into theory. He loved teaching theory. He loved having people honor theory and all that. And, it makes me realize, so some of the people in your background are these very theory driven, very conventional musicians and composer types. But then all of the influence of CalArts, plus all of the influence of the jazz people that you were following, were like pulling you in a completely different direction. Where was the balance for you of utilizing the things you learned in theory and composition classes, combining them with the free flow of Herbie's bands or whatever, and combined with sort of the conceptual head rush that comes from talking to John Cage? How do you pull these things all together?
The hard part about being an artist, especially a commercial artist, is the fact that you're going to get a lot of criticism. And the truth is, you just have to do the best you can, So what does that mean? And how does that distill itself down to an aesthetic, And
right.
The truth is it's a question of like whether you can write music that actually gets people to react.
Right.
I mean, this is something that's really funny is for years until I met John Frankenheimer, I was writing really cool music and people liked it. But when I met John, he wanted something that was cool, but he didn't really like that kind of music. He wanted me to write music that made people cry. He wanted me to be, I mean, in retrospect, God bless John. I mean, he asked me to be the movie for a moment. In that regard, first of all, there aren't that many people who get to do that, especially movies on the level that John Frankenheimer directed. There's a movie, Andersonville. It's a Civil War movie. So obviously there's no electronic music instruments on this movie, right?
Right.
And here we are. It's like we're spotting the movie, and this is a mini series. And here we are 5 minutes from the end of the entire thing. And John gets up and goes, okay, well, there's music from now to the rest of the movie. There's no dialogue. There's just music. So that's it. I got to go. We'll see you later. Like, at first you think about this and you think, holy shit, this is really insane. But the truth is it's a gift, right?
Yeah.
It's, who gets to be yourself in front of millions of people? Very, very fortunate to have met the filmmakers I work with and, who had confidence enough for me to be Gary, and the truth is that all the various experiences I had, they encouraged me to wear a different colored shirt at the time that I was into it,
Mm-hmm.
But in the reality of life, eventually you have to be yourself. If you're not, you're making a big mistake. You know what I'm saying? It's
right.
Like, how often do you get a chance to write something that that millions of people are going to hear? So it's like, you might as well be you. And that's the funny thing is, I know what the next question is, which is, how do you know what you is, right?
Exactly. Especially when you can change a lot over a long period of time. You have been composing for an extraordinary time period. The you of you has changed a lot during that period.
Yes. The reality is it's about that evolution that enables you to be an educated writer. It's like if everything stayed the same, that's where I see my friends who are pop artists and how hard it must be to be James Taylor, right? And play Fire and Rain at the end of every concert for the rest of your life. I'm not saying that there's something wrong with that, right?
No.
But it is at the same time, that's a question you ask him in an interview, and he'll say, like I've been through Fire and Rain with that song, right? Mm-hmm. So like I love it and I hate it, and and in the end, like my fans love it, so I'm playing it for them.
Right.
So there's a gift, an incredible gift as the film composer when a director says, "Be the movie."
Mm-hmm.
And next year, you don't have to be the movie. Well, there are movies that are huge musical hits that everyone mimics for the rest of your life, like Shawshank Redemption or something like that. But I think that was the exciting part of my career is like, yeah, I got to be me for a second.
Well, Gary, unfortunately, our time is up, but what a beautiful story. I have one last question. For people who want to hear your scoring work, generally speaking, you can go and find and listen to existing scores, but you also talk about your own personal music development creations that you've done. Where might people be able to listen to some of those? Do they have to come over to your house?
Yeah. This is the funny thing is I have no problem being an Emily Dickinson in this, I mean, in the end, it's like I've led a private life as much as I possibly have been able to. And it's not to say that I don't want to share my music. I suppose if you wander around my Facebook page, you'll find some links in some of my posts there to stuff, but I don't really have a huge spot where I'm just basically showing all that stuff. And I'm sorry about that to whoever's interested in. But as I said, it's sort of my music making. I have an analogy here. This might be interesting for for this, Darwin. I have a metaphor for artists, and artists are people who like to stand out in the middle of the stream. They stand out in the middle of the water. They like watching the water rush by. And meanwhile, everyone on the shore sits there and says, "What the fuck are you doing?" Then one day a fish swims down the stream and into your pocket. And everyone on the shore goes, "Oh, I get it. You're a fisherman." And then they spend all their time talking to you about fishing. But the reality is all you really like to do is stand out in the middle of the stream, Right. And I think that's the truth about electronic music. That's the truth about music in general. I'm so fascinated by it. I'm happy that I had, I'm happy to have an excuse to have spent most of my life and most of my resources on this crazy electronic music thing. It's really been an amazing, fascinating thing,
Indeed. Well, thank you so much for having this chat. It was fascinating. And thank you for sharing all this with us. I am incredibly inspired.
Oh, you're welcome, Darwin. Thank you.
Many thanks to Gary for having the great chat. It was really, really interesting to hear about how he came up through the system, how he kind of like surfed through all the different technological changes that we've seen over the last many years. If you get a chance, get out there, surf around, look into some of his work. There's stuff both for his solo work and as well as his soundtrack work. Sniff it out. It's not necessarily easy to find, but it's worth it. I want to thank all of you listeners for continuing to support me. If you get a chance, head on over to Patreon. That's patreon.com/DarwinGrosse, Grosse. In addition to just a weekly blog that I do in the midweek, I have some specials for people who are contributors. And in fact, this week you'll get a chance to hear Gary talk a little bit about the gear in his studio. So generally some neat stuff there. And if you get a chance, head on over. And in any case, thank you so much for listening, and I'll catch you next time around. Bye.